Introduction. Overview of Just Mercy. Just Mercy by Bryan Stevenson is a powerful narrative that delves into the deep-rooted issues of systemic injustice and inequality in the American legal system. As a defense attorney, Stevenson weaves together personal stories of those marginalized by the justice system, particularly focusing on racial injustice, wrongful convictions, and the death penalty. The book largely centers on the case of Walter McMillian, an African-American man wrongfully convicted and sentenced to death in Alabama, but it also expands to include numerous other cases that highlight the failures of a system meant to deliver justice. Throughout the book, Stevenson advocates for empathy, compassion, and the need for reform in criminal justice. Just Mercy is not just a memoir of Stevenson's legal career but a call to action, revealing the human impact of unjust laws, mass incarceration, and the death penalty. It emphasizes the need for mercy, justice, and dignity for all, particularly those marginalized by race and poverty. Chapter 1. Mockingbird Players. In this opening chapter, Stevenson introduces the reader to the story of Walter McMillian, who was wrongly convicted of murder in Alabama. McMillian, a black man, is accused of killing a white woman, despite having multiple alibi witnesses. His case reflects the racial prejudice and systemic failures of the justice system in the Deep South. Stevenson recalls the challenges of getting involved in cases like McMillian's, with deep-rooted racial biases, and how his organization, the Equal Justice Initiative, EJI, works to correct these injustices. Key concepts. 1. Racial injustice. The wrongful conviction of McMillian highlights the deep racial inequality that continues to exist in the criminal justice system. 2. Presumption of guilt. Stevenson introduces the concept that black defendants are often presumed guilty before a trial even begins, especially in cases involving white victims. 3. Inadequate defense. Many defendants on death row are often provided with poor legal representation, which can lead to wrongful convictions. Important quotes. The opposite of poverty is not wealth. The opposite of poverty is justice. Walter's conviction was based on lies, false evidence, and racism. Key lessons. In the justice system, racial bias can lead to the presumption of guilt for marginalized groups, which in turn results in wrongful convictions. True justice can only be achieved when all people, regardless of race or class, are treated equally under the law. Chapter 2. Stand. Stevenson discusses his early legal career and the development of the EJI, the non-profit law office he founded to provide legal representation to those who have been wrongly convicted or are on death row. He reflects on the challenges faced in working within a broken system, as well as the emotional toll of dealing with individuals who face extreme sentences. He also reveals the connection between poverty, race, and injustice, discussing how poor individuals are disproportionately affected by the criminal justice system. Key concepts. 1. Poverty and injustice. Poverty plays a significant role in the type of defense one can afford, often determining the outcome of a case. 2. Mass incarceration. The chapter begins to touch on the larger issue of mass incarceration in America and how it disproportionately affects the poor and minorities. Important quotes. Each of us is more than the worst thing we've ever done. The true measure of our character is how we treat the poor, the disfavored, the accused, the incarcerated, and the condemned. Key lessons. The justice system in America often punishes people not for what they did, but for who they are, poor, black, or marginalized. Compassion and understanding are crucial in addressing the systemic problems within the criminal justice system. Chapter 3. Trials and Tribulations. This chapter focuses on the trial of Walter McMillian and how it was fraught with errors, lies, and manipulation by those in power. Despite evidence proving his innocence, McMillian was convicted and sentenced to death. Stevenson describes the corrupt practices of local law enforcement and the biases that influence the outcome of trials in the South. Key concepts. 1. Wrongful convictions. The chapter explores how wrongful convictions occur and the failures in the justice system that allow them to happen. 2. Corruption and bias in the legal system. The role of corrupt officials, manipulated evidence, and jury bias in convicting innocent people. Important quotes. Capital punishment means them without the capital get the punishment. People are not always willing to acknowledge the lives of the poor and forgotten. Key lessons. Corruption within the justice system, especially in areas with deeply ingrained racial prejudice, can lead to devastating consequences for innocent people. Reforms are necessary to ensure that law enforcement and judicial processes are transparent and fair. Chapter 4. The Old Rugged Cross. Stevenson expands on his growing involvement in death row cases and reflects on the psychological burden of defending individuals who are facing death sentences. He recounts how death penalty cases are often handled without care or due diligence, reflecting the broader issues of the American legal system, where the poor and marginalized are neglected. Key concepts. 1. Death penalty. The chapter delves into the moral and ethical concerns surrounding the death penalty, questioning whether it can ever be justified. 2. Psychological impact. Stevenson discusses the emotional toll that working on death row cases has on lawyers and how the weight of these cases can lead to burnout. Important quotes. Why do we want to kill all the broken people? I began to understand why some people don't care about the death penalty. Key lessons. The death penalty is an inherently flawed punishment that disproportionately targets the most vulnerable in society. Lawyers, especially those defending death row inmates, face significant emotional and psychological stress due to the gravity of their work. Chapter 5. Of the Coming of John. In this chapter, Stevenson reflects on his personal journey and the inspiration he draws from historical figures who fought for justice. The title references W.E.B. Du Bois' story of the Coming of John, a tale about racial injustice and its impact on the soul. Stevenson draws parallels between the struggles of past generations and the fight against the injustice he faces in his career. Key concepts. 1. Historical parallels. The fight for racial justice is ongoing, and Stevenson draws connections between his work and the larger struggle for civil rights. 2. Hope and resistance. Despite the overwhelming odds, Stevenson emphasizes the importance of hope and resistance in the face of systemic injustice. Important quotes. There is a strength, a power even, in understanding brokenness. I am persuaded that the opposite of poverty is not wealth. The opposite of poverty is justice. Key lessons. Historical injustices continue to affect present-day society, and the fight for justice requires resilience and hope. The legal system must be reformed to address the inequalities that have been present for generations. Chapter 6. Surely Doomed. In this chapter, Stevenson details the numerous roadblocks and hurdles he faces in trying to reopen Walter McMillion's case. Despite clear evidence pointing to McMillion's innocence, the justice system remains indifferent or even hostile toward his cause. This indifference is not limited to McMillion's case but reflects a broader issue of judicial apathy toward wrongful convictions, especially those involving people of color. Key concepts. 1. Systemic indifference. Stevenson illustrates how the legal system often resists correcting its mistakes, especially when it comes to convictions of marginalized individuals. 2. Fight against the odds. The chapter focuses on the immense difficulties lawyers face in appealing wrongful convictions, especially in death penalty cases. Important quotes. There are some people in this world who don't deserve mercy. And that's why we have the death penalty. But I knew we all need mercy, we all need justice, and perhaps we all need some measure of unmerited grace. Key lessons. The justice system often resists change, even in the face of clear evidence of wrongful convictions. Mercy and grace are crucial components of justice, and everyone deserves a chance at redemption. Chapter 7. Justice Denied. This chapter provides a broader perspective on the death penalty and wrongful convictions by introducing several other cases that Stevenson handled, alongside Macmillion's. He shows that Macmillion's case is not unique. Many individuals have been unjustly sentenced to death. Stevenson explains how the appeals process is long, convoluted, and often unproductive, with courts reluctant to acknowledge errors in past cases. Key concepts. 1. Injustice in capital punishment. Stevenson emphasizes that the death penalty is often administered unfairly, with racial bias playing a significant role. 2. Institutional obstacles. Even when there is strong evidence of innocence, institutional resistance can make overturning wrongful convictions nearly impossible. Important quotes. The death penalty is not about whether people deserve to die for the crimes they commit. The real question is whether we deserve to kill. The United States has more than 2.3 million people behind bars, and we are the most punitive nation on earth. Key lessons. The death penalty is administered in a system that is rife with errors, racial bias, and injustice. The appeal process for wrongful convictions is incredibly difficult, and courts are often unwilling to admit mistakes. Chapter 8. All God's Children. Stevenson turns his attention to the treatment of children in the justice system, revealing how minors are often subjected to the same harsh sentences as adults, including life without parole. He focuses on the case of Joe Sullivan, a mentally disabled 13-year-old boy sentenced to life without parole for a crime he did not commit. Stevenson critiques the lack of understanding in the legal system when it comes to juveniles and emphasizes the importance of rehabilitation over punishment. Key concepts. 1. Juvenile justice. The chapter highlights the injustice of treating minors like adults in the criminal justice system. 2. Rehabilitation versus punishment. Stevenson argues that children, in particular, should be given a chance at rehabilitation instead of being condemned to a lifetime of punishment. Important quotes. We are all implicated when we allow other people to be mistreated. The question is not whether children deserve to be punished. The question is whether we believe they deserve a chance to recover. Key lessons. Children should not be subjected to the same harsh punishments as adults. The justice system must prioritize rehabilitation for minors. Society is responsible for how it treats the most vulnerable, including children. Chapter 9. I'm Here. This chapter focuses on the emotional toll that death row cases take on both the inmates and their families. Stevenson shares the story of Herbert Richardson, a Vietnam War veteran with severe PTSD who was sentenced to death for an accidental killing. Richardson's case exemplifies the failure of the justice system to account for mental illness, particularly when it comes to veterans who have experienced trauma. Stevenson is present at Richardson's execution, a harrowing experience that deepens his resolve to fight against the death penalty. Key concepts. 1. Mental illness in the justice system. The chapter sheds light on how mental illness is often ignored or inadequately addressed in criminal cases, leading to unjust sentences. 2. Trauma of execution. Stevenson highlights the emotional and psychological toll that executions take on everyone involved, from the condemned to their families and even defense lawyers. Important quotes. I've represented mentally ill people whose illness drove them to the crime for which they were convicted and condemned. I couldn't stop thinking about how broken he was, how much he needed help, not death. Key lessons. Mental illness must be treated with understanding and compassion in the justice system, not with punitive measures. The death penalty is a traumatic experience for everyone involved and is a profound failure of a compassionate justice system. Chapter 10. Mitigation. In this chapter, Stevenson dives deeper into the practice of mitigation, the process of presenting evidence of a defendant's background, such as mental illness, childhood trauma, or poverty, to argue for a lesser sentence. He presents the story of a young woman named Avery, who was imprisoned for a nonviolent crime but received a disproportionately harsh sentence due to her mental illness. Stevenson emphasizes that mitigation is often ignored in favor of punitive measures, further entrenching the cycle of mass incarceration. Key concepts. 1. Mitigation as a legal tool. Stevenson explains how mitigating circumstances, such as trauma or mental illness, should be considered in sentencing but often are not. 2. Cycle of incarceration. The chapter highlights how failure to address the root causes of crime, such as poverty and mental illness, leads to a cycle of incarceration and reoffending. Important quotes. We've been taught that the way to win is to punish others for their mistakes and shortcomings. It's not about whether someone is innocent or guilty, it's about how much mercy we're willing to show. Key lessons. Mitigating factors, such as mental illness or childhood trauma, should be considered in sentencing, as they often reveal deeper issues that need addressing. Punishment without addressing the root causes of crime only perpetuates the cycle of incarceration. Chapter 11. I'll Fly Away. In this chapter, Stevenson recounts the breakthrough in Walter McMillion's case, as new evidence comes to light that proves his innocence. The corrupt nature of the initial investigation and trial is laid bare, and McMillion is finally exonerated after spending 6 years on death row. The chapter is a moment of victory, but Stevenson also reflects on the years of McMillion's life that were unjustly taken from him. Key concepts. 1. Exoneration. The chapter highlights the hard-won victories in overturning wrongful convictions and how exoneration is a form of justice, though often delayed. 2. Corruption in law enforcement. Stevenson continues to expose the corruption and manipulation by law enforcement that led to McMillion's wrongful conviction. Important quotes. We all need to be forgiven for something. Walter was finally going to be free, but the scars of the injustice would never fully heal. Key lessons. Exoneration, while a victory, often comes too late to undo the damage caused by wrongful convictions. The criminal justice system must be held accountable for the injustices it perpetuates. Chapter 12. Mother, Mother. Stevenson reflects on the broader societal implications of mass incarceration, focusing on how the justice system disproportionately targets poor and marginalized communities, particularly women and mothers. He shares the story of Marcia Colbay, a woman sentenced to life without parole after her baby was stillborn. Her case exemplifies how the justice system often criminalizes poor women for circumstances beyond their control. Key concepts. 1. Criminalization of poverty. The justice system often punishes poor women for situations that are a result of their socio-economic status. 2. Impact on families. Mass incarceration tears families apart, particularly affecting women and their children. Important quotes. In too many places, poor women are condemned for their poverty. The system had deemed them irredeemable, but I knew they were anything but. Key lessons. Poverty and inequality often lead to unjust convictions, particularly for women. Mass incarceration has far-reaching consequences for families and communities, not just the individuals incarcerated. Chapter 13. Recovery. In this chapter, Stevenson discusses the emotional and psychological recovery needed after enduring such extreme injustices. He shares the stories of individuals who have been exonerated and released from death row but continue to struggle with the trauma of their wrongful imprisonment. The chapter focuses on the idea that justice is not only about correcting wrongs but also about helping people recover and rebuild their lives after suffering systemic failures. Key concepts. 1. Post-incarceration trauma. The chapter highlights the lasting impact of wrongful imprisonment and the psychological scars it leaves on individuals. 2. The role of community. Stevenson emphasizes the importance of community support in helping formerly incarcerated individuals reintegrate into society. Important quotes. The real measure of our society is how we treat those who are broken. For the survivors of this system, justice means more than freedom. It means healing. Key lessons. Exonerated individuals face significant challenges in recovering from the trauma of wrongful imprisonment. True justice requires not just exoneration but also support for those who have suffered injustice. Chapter 14. Cruel and Unusual. In this chapter, Stevenson explores the use of life sentences without parole for minors, focusing on cases where children as young as 13 have been sentenced to die in prison. He critiques the Supreme Court's ruling that allows these sentences and argues that it is a violation of the Eighth Amendment's prohibition of cruel and unusual punishment. Stevenson draws attention to the psychological and developmental differences between children and adults, emphasizing that children should not be subjected to the same harsh punishments as adults. Key concepts. 1. Juvenile sentencing. Children are often given disproportionately harsh sentences, including life without parole, despite their age and potential for rehabilitation. 2. Cruel and unusual punishment. Stevenson argues that sentencing children to die in prison is a violation of their constitutional rights. Important quotes. "Kids like me were getting life without parole, a punishment that meant we would die in prison. We are all more than the worst thing we've ever done." Key lessons. The criminal justice system must recognize the differences between children and adults and offer opportunities for rehabilitation rather than condemning children to life in prison. Sentencing minors to life without parole is a violation of their human and constitutional rights. Chapter 15. Broken. This chapter delves deeper into the idea that society is broken, particularly in its treatment of the marginalized. Stevenson reflects on the brokenness of the legal system, the people it punishes, and the broader societal structures that perpetuate inequality. He shares stories of individuals who have been failed by the justice system and argues that recognizing our shared humanity is the first step toward meaningful reform. Key concepts. 1. Shared brokenness. Stevenson emphasizes that everyone, including those in power and those marginalized by the system, carries some form of brokenness. 2. Reform through compassion. He argues that compassion and empathy are essential for addressing the systemic issues that lead to mass incarceration and injustice. Important quotes. "We are all broken by something. We have all hurt someone and been hurt. We all share the condition of brokenness even if our brokenness is not equivalent. Brokenness can be healed if we embrace it and work toward justice and mercy." Key lessons. Recognizing the shared brokenness of humanity can lead to greater empathy and motivate systemic reforms in the justice system. True justice involves not only punishment but also mercy, compassion, and efforts to heal the brokenness in society. Chapter 16. The Stonecatcher's Song of Sorrow. This chapter introduces the concept of stonecatchers, those who choose to shield others from harm and injustice, inspired by the biblical story where Jesus stops an execution by telling the crowd, "Let he who is without sin cast the first stone." Stevenson explains that his work, and the work of others like him, is to be stonecatchers, those who intervene and advocate for mercy, justice, and empathy. The chapter also touches on the broader social movement toward criminal justice reform and how ordinary people can play a role in advocating for change. Key concepts. 1. The role of stonecatchers. Stevenson uses this metaphor to describe people who dedicate themselves to catching and preventing the injustices that others inflict, rather than joining in punishment. 2. Empathy and justice. The chapter emphasizes the importance of empathy in the fight for justice, with Stevenson arguing that understanding and compassion are the keys to meaningful reform. Important quotes. "You can't understand most of the important things from a distance. You have to get close. I guess I'm a stonecatcher now." Key lessons. True justice is achieved not by punishing the guilty, but by working to prevent and correct injustices. Anyone can be a stonecatcher by standing up for those who are vulnerable, marginalized, and treated unfairly by society. Conclusion. The power of mercy. In the final section of the book, Stevenson reflects on the progress that has been made in the fight against systemic injustice, but also the long road ahead. He reiterates that the pursuit of justice is not just about correcting wrongful convictions, but about creating a society where mercy and compassion are at the forefront of how we treat others. Stevenson expresses hope that by continuing to fight for reforms and by fostering empathy, the legal system and society as a whole can evolve to be more just and humane. Key concepts. 1. The need for continued reform. Stevenson acknowledges that while there have been victories, the criminal justice system remains deeply flawed, and more work needs to be done. 2. The role of mercy. He emphasizes that mercy should not be seen as weakness but as a powerful force for change and justice. Important quotes. Mercy is just when it is rooted in hopefulness and freely given. The death penalty and mass incarceration are symptomatic of larger problems in our society. Key lessons. Mercy is a crucial aspect of justice, and fostering a society that values compassion is the key to meaningful reform. The fight for justice is ongoing, and change will require continuous effort from individuals and society at large. Key takeaways from Just Mercy. 1. Systemic injustice. The book offers a powerful critique of the American legal system, highlighting how it disproportionately affects marginalized groups, particularly African Americans, the poor, and the mentally ill. 2. The death penalty and wrongful convictions. Stevenson provides numerous examples of how the death penalty is unfairly applied, often leading to the wrongful conviction of innocent people. 3. The importance of empathy. A central theme of Just Mercy is the need for empathy and understanding in the justice system, not only for the accused but also for their families and communities. 4. Hope and change. Despite the overwhelming challenges, Stevenson remains hopeful that with continued advocacy and reform, the legal system can become more just and equitable. 5. The power of individual action. The book underscores that change is possible when individuals choose to stand up for justice and become stone catchers who protect others from injustice. Just Mercy by Bryan Stevenson is not only a call for reform in the criminal justice system, but also an appeal to recognize the shared humanity of all people, especially those who have been marginalized. The book emphasizes the need for compassion, mercy, and understanding in the pursuit of justice, while also highlighting the deep flaws that still exist within the legal system today.